Hello and welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I am Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Cover Journal. Today's sponsor is Sungard Availability Services, and the topic is preparing for post-recovery data loss, how ransomware has raised the ante. Before we get started, I want to review a couple housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. This recording will be shared with everyone via an email tomorrow. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask any questions, please use the question function located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. And now I'd like to introduce you to John Beatty. John has been a principal consultant within Sungard Availability Services for over 12 years, where he consults on operational risk and resilience programs encompassing business continuity, disaster and data recovery, and vendor risk management. He previously held positions with News Corporations and Ernst & Young. John is also a fellow of the BCI. And with no further delay, I'd like to now welcome and turn the mic over to John.
Bob, thanks so much. And everyone, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you may be. So I do want to apologize very quickly for this presentation has some great builds in it, some great animation, but unfortunately we're going to be a little constrained today, but as we dig into this. Let me start by saying that, the title of this presentation is about recovering data and reflects that, and how ransomware has played a big part in having us all realize that we need to be more diligent around our data protection and be more diligent around our ability to recover data after a successful ransomware attack that compromises our production data. So let me kind of jump in and chat a bit. Some interesting statistics, and I apologize for the layout on the screen. It might be a little hard to read on some of the slides, but we'll get through it. So I could literally change this slide probably every day with new numbers, new statistics, new information. But as you can see here, and the gray box probably fascinates me more than any other. Cybercrime is now the third largest world economy, behind only the United States and China. And it has a larger value, if you will, than the entire economy of Japan. So obviously, it's big business, and it's not going away. And I can't imagine that there isn't a day that goes by that we don't hear something new about it. In Q1 of this year, in that second column, 23 days, a survey that was taken by Coveware indicated that the 23 days was the average downtime in the aftermath of a successful ransomware attack, and that was in Q1 of this year, by the way. And 50 million, well, that's the largest ransomware that was ever demanded. But so the numbers are getting bigger, and we know from the Colonial Pipeline, who just paid 5 million that we know of, possibly even more. This threat is continuing, and the ante has never been bigger. Therefore, it is quite incumbent on organizations to take matters into their own hands and be ready to deal with a successful ransomware attack should it happen to you. Okay. So apologize for a couple things here for the slide layout, but there's actually a couple words that are missing, but that's okay. I'll read through it. So, RPOs have been around for a long time, literally for decades. I can remember, the first time I was involved in a BIA for an organization where I was an IT director, and we did the RTO and the RPO thing. And but what's interesting there is that when we identify RPOs, and let's say it's an RPO other than 0, it's 4 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, doesn't matter, we have given IT permission to not recover that much data. If you think about it from that perspective, it's kind of eye-opening to say, well, if we've given them permission to not recover a certain amount of data, what are we going to do if there is a disaster and they are able to meet the RPO, but no better than that? So let's just hypothetically say we have an application with an RPO of 24 hours. So what is the business going to do to recover that data? What is the protocol that the business is going to take? Because IT is going to meet their RPOs, assuming they can, and through good testing. What the second bullet is supposed to say is, few organizations expect or require the business community to predefine just how they will fill the gap. So we know that there is a gap. We have given IT permission to have a gap, but very rarely, do we actually take the time to figure out in each department that depends on different application systems, again, each with an RPO, what is the business going to do? And very rarely do the organizations ever document that. But as the third bullet there says, the data recovery challenges have the ante's been raised, as pointed out on the cover of this presentation, because what you unfortunately can't read is that the data loss gap in a cyber recovery case will likely exceed the RPO values that were defined for traditional disaster scenario. And by the way, Bob's going to make sure that you all get a copy of this presentation in a PDF form, so you can actually read all the details. But we're gonna dig into this issue a little bit more on this next slide. And if I think about disaster recovery versus data recovery, two different recovery scenarios that all organizations need to plan for. A disaster is typically a data center compromising event, and a data recovery is initiated by a data compromising event. Very different situations. One tends to be more physical, one tends to be more logical, but it's really focused around data. In a disaster recovery situation, I'm going to shift from data center A to data center B, whether it's cloud, on-prem, doesn't much matter. I'm going, typically from, place A to place B. I'm going to a new place. But data recovery is done in place, meaning as soon as I can do a whole bunch of things to clean my production environment, make sure that it's malware free, and make sure that I can also, identify, clean data, to the best possible point in time that I can find it. I'm then going to bring that data that is, that I do find to be clean and malware free back into the production environment. Hence the concept that data recovery is in place. So clean my production environment, identify clean data, and I'm typically going to do that off network somewhere. We'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. And when I identify that clean data, I'm then going to bring it back into production and do my recovery again in place. Data currency, not too worried about it with regard to disaster recovery. I'm probably going to meet my RTOs and meet my RPO values. Those are little green dots, are actually check marks. Assuming I've done good testing, if you will, I should be able to meet my RTOs, and very importantly, my RPOs. And however, in a cyber attack situation, RTOs are totally out the window. Forget those. Those don't even apply to the situation, just due to the amount of time it's going to take an organ, unless your RTOs are 2 weeks. We saw on the first page, the average downtime was 23 days in Q1 of this year. So can't imagine there are any RTO values that are in measured, in numbers bigger than 23 days. So RTOs are out the window, because I have a lot of investigation to do, a lot of, assuring that the production environment is malware free, before I can bring my systems back up and make them operational again and reactivate my network. So RTOs, there's an X there. RPOs, it's possible to meet your RPOs in a, in the aftermath of a cyber attack, but that doesn't usually happen. And so let's dig into that a little bit more here. So in order for the bad actors to have a chance, make their best case, if you will, for you to pay the ransom, they not only have to compromise your production environment, but they also have to compromise your data backups, and they are good at that. Your replicas, well, obviously those are going to be useless. And the best of the best of the bad actors, they're going to first compromise your data backups before they take out production. And they want to make sure that they can do their best to make sure that you have no recourse to get your data back, except to pay them. So, if you do pay the ransom, and by the way, it fluctuates over time, but between 50 and 60% of organizations who are faced with a ransomware attack do pay the ransom. They may do it through a third party. They may do it very, much under the covers, if you will. But 50 to 60% of ransomware demands are actually paid, usually for a negotiated number that's less than the initial ask. The bad actors are more than happy to negotiate to a degree. Let me get back to the RPO issue. The RPOs, if your data has been compromised for, let's say for a week or two prior to the actual ransomware attack actually manifesting itself, then you probably don't have good backups to rely on, because most organizations don't keep backups for, especially if they're online, for extended periods of time. You may well be, not be able to recover your data, and therefore not be able to meet your RPO values. So we know that that's the game of the bad actors. So it's incumbent on all organizations to be prepared, for this eventuality. So I want to point out some interesting, thoughts on this. What the analysts have to say, Forrester, Gartner, and it's not just Sungard's position, but these reputable organizations in the past, since August of last year, have actually back into 2019 have all come on record to say DR planning must account for ransomware attacks. It's a different recovery case. You cannot treat ransomware as the domain of your security team, because in order to recover data, it is not the responsibility of your CISO. It is the responsibility of infrastructure and operations, typically a DR team. So your DR programs are very ingrained in the making sure that your organization is well established and well able to recover data in the aftermath of a successful cyber attack. CISO's job is to make sure that those things, do their best to make sure it doesn't happen. But errors happen, mistakes happen, people do things they shouldn't do. Malware comes in a back door through a trusted through a trusted partner. The list goes on in terms of how it actually happens. So when it does happen, it is not the responsibility of any CISO that we have come across so far to actually recover the data. They're certainly part of the team. They have to make sure it's malware free, and they have to do all their analytics to make sure everything's safe. But push comes to shove, if you have a DR team, it's most likely going to be falling on you. So it's important that organizations, and we'll talk more about what actually does need to be put in place in just a few minutes. Okay, let's see how this next slide works. Okay, so a few things that I wanted to point out, and we at Sungard have created a framework that we think that if all organizations address key elements of this particular framework, you will have a fighting chance to be able to recover data in the aftermath of that successful cyber attack that we've been talking about. So, and by the way, we're going to get to the business side of this whole thing in a minute, because the business folks are not off the hook. Okay, so in the identify column, and we kind of framed this thing after the the NIST cybersecurity framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. So I'm going to start with the protect column. So it's very important that organizations step up their game on being able to back up data. Secured immutable backups is the first thing that's listed there. And what that simply means, and there's many solutions for this, by the way. There's software solutions, backup solutions. there's hardware solutions, air gap. There's many different terms that are floating around, and the landscape is changing constantly. So, but it's very important that you have, extended amounts of backups, and do your best to make sure that those backups are protected against access by a bad actor, so they can't disrupt your data, so that you can rely on your backups to respond to a successful ransomware attack. Having secured immutable backups, and we'll talk more about that in just a couple minutes too, that's very, very key. So in order to, typically to establish, to keep much longer history of data, to step up your game, if you will, and to invest in some of the newer technologies that are in place today for taking those backups and for managing those backups, you're going to be most likely spending more money, because you're going to be, increasing your capital costs potentially, and then you're also going to be maintaining longer histories of data, hopefully in a location that has minimal access to, minimal network connection time. And so therefore, if I go back to the first column, identify, what many organizations are doing is they're identifying their vital data assets, not their critical data, their vital data. And what vital data means is, what is the data that is, warrants an extra duty of care, an extra duty of investment to make sure that I have a longer history of it, that I'm keeping, the copies that I'm managing in this immutable storage arena, or this immutable storage vault, if you will, has minimal, network access time, to do everything that I possibly can to make sure that I've got good, clean data to use for recovery purposes, should that ransomware attack be successful. So vital data is the must-have data, the data that you absolutely have to make sure I must have this data, or my organization is at risk. I'm not going to be able to serve my customers well. And what's very, very interesting with the organizations that we have worked with around this particular topic, we have always found, and so far, that there is data that is considered vital to the organization that is not in the scope of the current disaster recovery program. And a lot of that has to do with data that might be more local, might be running manufacturing equipment, and it simply hasn't gotten the attention, or it may have a very long RTO, but potentially a very short RPO. So the RPO could be 0, but the RTO could be a month, 2 months. I can afford to not have access to it, but when it comes back, it better be spot on, in other words. So we haven't found an organization yet where all of the data that was truly considered vital to the survival of the organization, and by the way, financial data is typically not considered vital in organizations. It's really about being able to continue to meet customer needs, being able to continue to generate revenue, and meet obligations. Some level of regulatory data manages, but there's also infrastructure data. Not just business applications, but there's also infrastructure data in there, as well. And again, sometimes that data is not part of a disaster recovery program. So, it's incumbent on organizations to figure out which data is worthy of an extra duty of care, an extra level of investment, and then that extra level of investment manifests itself with that secured immutable backup, or that secured immutable vault that's in the second column. The secured analytic environment simply means that if my production environment is compromised, that's going to get locked down. And if I have my data, off-site or in the cloud or wherever I might be keeping my, vaulted data, I need to also be able to stand up a separate environment so that I can actually begin to do my research on that data off network to identify, well, what is the cleanest malware-free point-in-time data that I actually do have based on what was actually compromised. So it was a particular application system, whether it was a particular infrastructure system, like say Active Directory. What's the point in time that I have clean data? I'm usually going to start looking at that, having a team start looking into that right away. And again, that's going to be done off network, and hopefully that your data vault is also off network. So that protect column is really around having a safe environment, a safe off-network environment where I have copies of data and where I can actually begin to analyze that data in parallel with another team working on the to clean the production environment and to make sure that it's malware free. And typically, when you're trying to identify clean data, in many cases organizations use a third party that is really experts in helping to and understands the threat actor that caused penetrated your environment, and also good at finding where that malware may be and making sure that they can advise you on the best way to get rid of it. In that detect column, if I do have my immutable data vault, I need to be making sure that I'm scanning that. I'm looking for odd behavior, excessive numbers of reads and writes, and there's many of the hardware and software solutions that are out there will actually do some level of that for you, looking for anomalies in behavior in order to identify if somebody is tampering with your immutable data vault. Deep and dark web assessments kind of go hand in hand with this. Periodically, for the data that you're most concerned about, see if it is up for sale, see if anybody is threatening to attack it. And there's third parties that can help you with those dark web, gray web scans to see if there is any activity that's going on out there on the dark web related to your organization and related to your data. So that's one way of getting an early warning that something nefarious is imminent. The respond column deals with two areas: cyber compromise data recovery management plan, and we'll talk more about that too. This is akin to a disaster recovery management plan, but it's very, very focused on the unique elements of a data recovery effort, and that's who's going to be responsible for cleaning my production environment. Are we going to rebuild servers from bare metal before we bring data back onto them? Are we going to isolate those servers because we might want to do forensics down the road, pull them off network, and then maybe I'm going to roll in new hardware and build that from bare metal before I bring data back into my production environment. So there's a lot of technical issues, a lot of and it's a very different recovery process, if you will, than your typical disaster recovery scenario. Again, we'll talk more about that. Business continuity strategies for data loss. Well, we started out right in the beginning talking about RPO values, and that most organizations do not put into their business continuity plans exactly how they're going to recover data equal to the RPO value. Now imagine losing data in excess of the RPO value. What's the business going to do? So those strategies and actions related to data loss for, at minimum, your vital data should be reflected in your business continuity plans. And again, we're going to dig into that. And like any good program, if you truly are going to be ready, you need to do various kinds of exercises that are kind of people focused, those tabletops, but you also have to do your actual data recovery tests so that everybody really knows what is expected of them at the time that you need to recover data. So we talked a little bit about IT, but again, in that respond column, we talked about the business continuity strategies for data loss. So I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. Okay, so it is important to expand business continuity plans to address unrecovered data. Again, relative to the RPO value, at minimum, but we believe and we recommend to organizations, and when we build business continuity plans these days, we tend to, do our best, even if it's through a BIA, to identify, what is some of that vital data. Although the process that we typically follow for identifying vital data is very different than a BIA. We actually go much more in depth than your typical BIA would do. But it's important that your business continuity plans begin to reflect how the business is going to continue to operate in the absence of systems, how they're going to operate in the absence of data, and how they're going to get that data back once again. And there's many ways to do that. How they're going to recreate it, how they're going to rebuild it, how they're going to mine for it, reacquire it. There's many strategies, and we're going to talk about those in just a couple minutes. So it's very important that for that vital data that you identify in your business continuity plans, just what role the business is going to play in getting back up and operational, and the data to be current. Because again, the responsibility for this, cannot and does not fall exclusively on IT. And that's exactly what the bad actors are counting on, is that you're going to be befuddled and not know how to deal with this whole thing. And then therefore in the heat of the situation, you're just simply going to revert to making the payment. And by the way, the bad actors, not all, but many of them do tend to give you back the decryption keys, because they want their reputation to be stellar, so that the next time they attack somebody, they're likely to pay, because organizations tend to begin to know that bad actor A, B, and C, if you make the payment, they're going to give you the decryption keys. So therefore, other organizations are more likely to pay, in the future, because they have a good reputation, if you will. So a couple of key questions, to ask before we move on, is, do you have approved RPOs? Most organizations, do, and have you, researched your what possible data loss, is typical, what's on average, and do your business continuity plans address it? And the answer is, if you answer no to any of these things, you have some work to do, and you need to be bringing that, bringing this to the attention of your management, so that you can get appropriate authorization to, again, expand your BC plans. And unfortunately, to deliver bad news, but better to deliver the bad news now than at time of the actual attack. So how large of a gap should you plan for? Again, if it's a disaster situation, RPO values are fine. But again, you can build into your business continuity plans just how you're going to cover the RPO gap. And you should do that at minimum. But following the ransomware attack, it could be minimum of a week, could be a month. We had one organization that we were working with earlier this year, and turns out they had the bad actors had gotten in and disabled some of their backups. They had an IT ticket that did not get a very high level of, it was basically a P3, if you will, relatively low priority. And nobody addressed it for 6 weeks, then the bad actors pulled the plug. Turns out they had no backup data for 6 weeks for their inventory management system. So they had no choice but to pay the ransom in order to get their inventory data back, because the cost of re-inventorying multiple warehouses was not something that they were too excited about doing, both from a time and a cost perspective. So typically, you have to plan on plan for, how am I going to recover data equal to RPO? How am I going to recover if I have to, if I lose a week's worth of data, and even be thinking about considering how am I going to recover data that's a month old or longer. Now, again, you can buy down a lot of that risk by ramping up your backup capabilities and taking advantage of some of the newer technologies that are out there, both from backup solutions as well as from hardware vendors, in order to create that immutable environment that is less likely to be attacked. But nothing is guaranteed. You can buy down risk, but you can't eliminate risk. So we believe that it's important for organizations to be thinking about the possibility of losing data in excess of a week, and in some cases, be thinking about losing data. How am I going to recreate? How is the business going to recreate data for even a month? Okay, so perhaps this slide will shed a little bit more light on it. So, and this kind of summarizes a few things that we've been talking about. If the scenario is a compromised data center, expected data loss is equal to the RTO values, that have been defined for each application. Typically, infrastructure and operations will tend to be, rely on their disaster recovery management plan that kind of oversees the entire thing, and who's doing what, who's responsible for doing, various tasks, standing up the disaster recovery site. And then many organizations will also have application-specific recovery plans, like for your human resource information system. And there'll be, obviously be many of those in order to stand up your DR environment. But when it comes to compromised data, again, your data in excess of the RTO values is at risk. But so organizations need a compromised data recovery management plan. Again, as I was talking about that earlier, who's going to be working in the secured environment to identify clean data and the most current point in time, and communicating with with the business people to make sure that related systems that depend on one another are all coming back, that got the data to bring them all back concurrently. So there will be often a VDA specific recovery plans for all of those applications. Because again, it's going to be different from bringing back an application. You're bringing back the data, and of course, if it's a virtualized environment, you're bringing the whole kit and caboodle back. But you need to be thinking about recovering data for your infrastructure systems as well, such as Active Directory. So as you can see in the table below, within each business continuity plan, if you have various if a department has a dependency on various vital data assets, you're going to have the appropriate strategy. So for for my warehouse inventory data, maybe I'm going to be recreated. I'm going to rebuild it. I'm going to reacquire it. And the differences there being, I might be doing a lot of manual, collection of the data and reentry. Rebuilding, maybe I can pull data from other application systems and other databases that have not been impacted, and I can rebuild data from that. In some cases, I can reacquire it, I can purchase it or acquire it, from a third party, and there's many other options. But within each BC plan, for each vital data asset, and you could do it by application if you wanted to. We prefer to stick with the VDA concept. Identify what my strategy is going to be, identify what are the specific actions, in order to do that, reacquire, rebuild, recreate, or whatever the strategy may be. Effectiveness over time. What that's about is, well, how far back, can I reacquire that data, and how effective, how far back can I actually, will that strategy be effective? Can I, rebuild from, manually? Maybe I'm going to be, looking at emails and looking at, other systems and trying to recreate. So at what point in time does the whole thing fail is what's really important. And usually the effectiveness of a strategy, decreases over time. And in some cases, like with a warehouse inventory system, especially a warehouse that's turning over, bringing new items in daily, and many items are going out, constantly. If I lose more than a day or so's worth of data, I just have to re-inventory the entire warehouse and start from scratch. So the effectiveness for a warehouse inventory system, may be, quite short. And whereas for other systems, like for other applications and other databases, I can actually um, you know count on data, even if I have data that's 6 weeks old, 6 months old. That's better. That's better than nothing. But 6-month-old warehouse data is generally pretty useless. And then, of course, who's in charge? Who's on these teams? Who's undertaking the actions? And again, that should all be reflected within your business continuity plans. So here's one final slide before I take some questions. I think it's important, and we believe it. The analysts believe it that I mentioned earlier. That data recovery is a specific recovery case within comprehensive disaster recovery and business continuity programs. Some data assets do require that extra duty of care and investment to reduce the risk of a failed data recovery effort. And that's really a very key term here is, you need to buy down as much risk as you believe necessary to reduce the chances of a failed data recovery effort. So, and again, some of the good practices that I mentioned in that table, it's worth thinking about. It's more than just keeping longer history of data. There's a lot more work to be done than simply expanding your data, than plugging in some new hardware, buying a new backup solution. You really need to round out your program and look just beyond the backups, and look at which data is the most important. If you're a publicly held organization, which data, if you lose it, is going to result in a risk identified in your 10K from materializing. You need to be prepared for all that, and to make your management well aware that you do have risk, and that there's opportunity to further buy down risk, and then let them make the decision as to whether or not they want to make the investment. You do want to have some additional investments and detect if you do have those additional backups and capabilities, that immutable vault. You've got to make sure that nobody's messing with that too. And again, many of the solutions out there do offer some degree of scanning and helping you identify weird behavior, if you will, in your backup environment. You have to put those plans in place, and of course, exercises and tests to make sure it's all going to work. So for many organizations, data recovery, since it is far more likely that that's going to happen to your organization than an actual traditional disaster or smoking hole, if you will, organizations really do need to be managing both of those recovery cases and being able to validate that they can actually be effective, should that happen. So I've done a lot of talking, so what I'd like to do is, Bob, are there any specific questions that I can answer?
Sure thing, John. And again, if you do have any questions for John, you can locate the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. Here today, we have several come in already. Let me read through here. First one, how has the business continuity community taken the notion that data will be lost and they need to be ready for that possibility?
The BC communities that we've worked with are, kind of starry-eyed over it. It's amazing how many organizations haven't even thought of building into their BC plans the fact that you need to figure out, how am I going to recover data, bridge the data loss gap equal to the RPO, let alone a month's worth, 2 months, or a week, 2 weeks, or maybe even a month's worth of data. That's usually like, that's the deer in the headlights syndrome, is when we bring that up to business continuity folks. And many still do put their heads in the sand on that particular topic, but and simply say, well, we've told IT what the RPO value is, that it's their problem. Well, the reality of the world of ransomware is, it's not their problem, it's the business's problem. So therefore, we're starting to see the BC community starting to open up on that. And again, when we build business continuity plans, for our clients, we raise that question and make sure that they're aware of the consequences of not doing it. But then ultimately the responsibility is theirs as to whether or not they want to include that in their VC plans. But we're seeing an upward trend in that. So good question.
All right, next question. Should RPO values be reduced because of the possibility of a ransomware attack?
So far, we haven't seen that happening, and that's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, I'm just going to lower the RPO value, and it's IT's problem to figure out the solution. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really an enterprise issue. It's a data risk issue. It's a risk management issue, and it's an enterprise risk issue. No, lowering RPO values is not going to solve the problem. All that's going to do is increase the potentially increase the budget for for backups for the backup organization on data that doesn't necessarily have to be that's not considered vital. So the knee-jerk reaction is, yes, let's just lower the RPO values and make everything zero, but that does not solve the problem. So you've got to separate your thinking between disaster recovery and data recovery, and recognize that RPOs do not apply no matter what value you place on them. You've got to have that secured, immutable, data vault, and make that kind of an investment. So I'd rather see organizations spend more money on spend their money on the data vault as opposed to trying to reduce RPO values.
All right, someone's asking if you can clarify the difference between data backup and data recovery.
Sure. So, most organizations will be taking data backups. Not talking about replication, but they'll be taking data backups, and they may take incrementals on a periodic basis, daily basis. They may be keeping those keeping the history of that for often short periods of time for the past week or so, because they've optimized their backup program for disaster recovery. So it's important to have backups, and for that data that's most vital, to have extended backups far in excess of the number of iterations in the time frame that you have for disaster purposes. So then it's incumbent upon organizations to have a plan, if you will, and understand how they're going to identify clean data, usually in off-network place, and then they have to repatriate it. That's the term that we've been using, back into the production environment. They're going to recover that data back into the production environment, and then the business has to cover the gap. If it's a disaster, they've got to cover the RPO. If it's a ransomware attack, they may have to be recreating, rebuilding, or reacquiring data, in excess of the RPO value. So if you kind of think about the entire recovery, IT's got a piece of recovery, and so does the business have a piece of the recovery, both for DR and for data recovery. So that's kind of how I'm seeing that difference.
All right, there's another question here. Doesn't data recovery and disaster recovery go hand in hand rather than data recovery being specific? Does that concept apply for every instant for data loss, or is it across the board?
So if I have this question right, if you go back to the slide with where the analyst said, disaster recovery and data recovery are two separate recovery cases. Disaster recovery plans do not work if you've been the victim of a ransomware attack. It's simply not going to be effective for you. And that's probably the 90-10 rule. Let me put it that way. So because again, it's incumbent upon the bad actors to destroy or encrypt your backup data before they impact your production data, or why would you pay them? So, and they are, like I said earlier, they're very good at it. So it's very important to recognize that these are two very distinct recovery cases, that the actions you're going to take are very, very different. What you're expecting your teams to do are very different. Your CISO's organization or a third party that you might bring in, maybe you've got an expert on retainer. There's the team composition is different. The challenges are very, very different, and so organizations need to be thinking about this second recovery case. And again, often the data recovery falls upon the disaster recovery team, but it does, your disaster recovery plan is not going to be effective. Mostly, the same people are involved plus some more in a traditional disaster recovery situation, but data recovery, different processes, different challenges, and many different things to be looking at, and your disaster recovery plan just isn't going to work. That's not what they were built for. They were built for if they're built for a fire, they weren't built for a snowstorm, and so to speak. It's a very, very different situation than one versus the other.
All right, from your opinion or knowledge, what percentage of organizations pay the ransom demand in order to get their data back?
I haven't heard anybody in the industry, people who are very, very familiar with the bad actors and people who actually do the negotiation with the bad actors. I have never heard any one of those organizations say it's less than 50%, and I haven't heard any one of them ever say that it's more than 60%. So I've just kind of adopted the 50% to 60% is the typical range of organizations that actually do, pay the ransom. Whether they pay it directly or indirectly, doesn't much matter. They're still, shelling out the cash, and usually doing that under advisement of an expert who's familiar with the individual bad actors and knows how to negotiate, the right kind of deal, and to coach you through it. So again, I've never heard any of those organizations giving a number less than 50%, and generally they're all saying in the in the 50% range is reality. And the reason that organizations are paying it is because they have not taken a look at data recovery as a special recovery case. That's why they pay the ransom, because they haven't done their extra due diligence. They haven't made those extra investments. They haven't bought down their risk, so therefore they have to pay the ransom in order to get their data back. If they had thought through the data recovery issue, they probably wouldn't have to deal with it.
And here's sort of a follow-up question to that topic is, do you see the acceptance increasing on paying ransoms while every expert continues to say that it should never be paid?
Well, I mean, the FBI says you should never pay it, and secondarily, if the threat actor is on the OFAC list here in the U.S., you're prohibited from paying it. So typically, your expert ransomware advisors, can advise you as to whether or not the the perpetrators are on that OFAC list. So there's that balance of am I paying something that's going to get me in trouble with the U.S. Department of Treasury, which it will if you pay somebody that's on the OFAC list. You're just gonna have to suck it up in that case. But there's many credible bad actors out there, if that's a good term to use, who are not on the OFAC list and will help you to get your data back far quicker than you can do it yourself, unless you have adopted key elements of that good practice framework that you see in the lower right-hand corner on the screen. So if you fail to address those items and think through them, you are probably at high risk of a failed data recovery effort.
All right, someone's asking if you'd be able to provide more context about vital data. For example, what are the characteristics and examples of vital data?
So lots of terms you can use. Must-have data, heartbeat of the organization. We've used that before. It's the data that's going to keep your customers, meeting your customer obligations, and in some cases your regulatory, obligations. So, if I'm in the food business and I've got, product in a warehouse, I've got to be able to continue to move those products out the door, so that I can, fulfill the orders for my product, for my food products, that are out there. So I've got to be able to make sure that, so that data is certainly more vital than the human resource system. Okay. Now we're not talking about data being exfiltrated in this particular case. We're talking about, and that complicates life, tremendously. If that is the case, it does happen in concert with data being encrypted. But it's truly about the data, that is essential to the survival of the organization and meeting your stated obligations, typically to your customer or client, or client base. So if you're a law firm, you can't afford to lose your matters database. If you're a manufacturer, you've got your inventory systems, your order entry systems. If your cash is going to be delayed for a few weeks, you're not going to be able to make collections. That's probably, in many organizations, not all, probably not the end of the world. So vital data is the stuff that I just cannot afford to lose this stuff, because if I do, maybe I'm going to throw out all of my, drugs that I manufactured in the past month. Well, that's a major problem, and a big ticket item. Not to mention that I'm not going to be able to meet, the demand for product in the organization. So there's many factors that go into it. Again, 10K risks should be looked at. It's you're looking at data from a far more strategic perception perspective than you are for disaster recovery. And quite often, you can identify vital data either through a top-down or from a bottom-up approach. But ultimately, executive management's going to, you're going to need them to sign off on it, and it's always different than what you identify in a BIA. We have not found similarities yet between what's been identified as critical application systems versus the vital data. And again, you got to narrow that down. And oh, by the way, vital data tends to be less than 10% of an organization's data. We've seen that as being a fairly reasonable rule. Some cases as low as 1% of data. So vital data is not a subset of disaster of your critical data identified for DR purposes. It's again, we often find vital data not in the scope of disaster recovery. I hope that helps.
All right, next question here. What team in an organization would be responsible and initiate efforts to implement data recovery programs and plans?
Well, typically, I guess I'll be saying it varies. And so, larger organizations, if they have a disaster recovery team, if they have, the head of infrastructure and operations is typically going to be recognized that, this falls squarely, on their shoulders with a lot of support from the InfoSec team, by the way. But the actual, standing up of data, presenting it to a cyber expert to say, to validate that the data is malware free, typically, lies on the, INO, infrastructure and operations, or the DR team, moving that data from the, where I've done my analytics off network and bringing it back into production. Again, infrastructure and operations. So the, the plans themselves for, are typically owned by the head of disaster recovery, usually part of infrastructure and operations, well supported in partnership with the CISO's organization. That's what we typically see, and we see organizations who actually fight over it. It's like, no, that's not mine. That must be yours. Oh, you're the CISO. You own it, and CISO says, no, I don't own data recovery. You own it. Infrastructure and operations. So we see some organizations actually not, nobody wants to say that it lands in their ballpark, but ultimately somebody has to own it. And again, more often than not, we see it as a disaster recovery team that owns it than any place else.
All right, we'll take one more question here today. Should we keep more data backup history as a way to assure data can be recovered after an attack?
Sometimes. And I say that because if I've got my warehouse inventory data, it's, in some organizations, a week old worth of inventory data is useless. However, for maybe my financial systems, find their way into this. Yeah, I can actually, if it's a month's worth, if you're going to roll me back a month, I can probably bring it forward from there and get my financial reporting out. So in some cases, more history makes sense. In other cases, it simply is of no use. And that's part of that vital data asset identification is, what is the point of that data becomes useless, needs to be well understood. And that's going to vary, for data of one kind versus another. So it's important to be thinking about, what are the characteristics and what is the point of no value, for backups. And then once you identify that point, you want to have your backups go to that point. No sense going farther than that point. And again, those values are going to vary database by database.
All right, wonderful. There are several questions we didn't get to here today. I will share these questions with John, and hopefully we can follow up with everyone after the webinar is ended here today. So any parting words here today, John?
I think the most important thing is that you all need to recognize that data recovery is a special recovery case, and the business has a role to play too, and the business needs to be aware that if they are the victim of you are the victim of a ransomware attack, that they may have a lot of catching up to do with regard to data that IT cannot recover, and that's an important realization to take back to your management, and get the necessary support and potentially funding that you need. So thank you.
All right, wonderful, excellent Q&A here today, John. And thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We hope gather some great information from today's webinar. I'd also like to personally thank John for his time here today, as well as Sungard Availability Services for sponsoring today's webinar. We again will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.